Hi, this is David Ailiff. I must admit I'm feeling really quite moved today. The interview that I've recorded with Jeff Alshorn is about the plague of our time, the other virus. Now, I feel moved because Jeff has written, or is in the process of writing, a PhD on AIDS and the responses in Australia to AIDS, the social impact and so on. And now we're going through this horrible COVID crisis, which is much less discriminatory than AIDS and has already caused thousands and thousands of deaths worldwide. I want to dedicate this interview, which is reasonably long. I have a YouTube piece in the middle of it. I do think it's worth watching, and I'd love to hear your comments. I want to dedicate this to a man called Jonathan. He was a friend of mine from my fundamentalist Christian years in what was really a fundamentalist cult. Jonathan was 10 years younger than me and gay. He wasn't able to come out as gay, though, until he left the group because of the group's beliefs and the restrictions that would have placed upon him. He just didn't feel comfortable to be real about who he was, as many people are in a similar situation for various reasons even today. I feel terribly sad about Jonathan, who died a few years ago. He actually did develop HIV Aids. And he was a very intelligent man. He could have pretty well done anything. His life after our group saw him do studies and develop his art, which was quite amazing, develop some wonderful friends. But his end was really quite tragic when he died of severe complications of the disease and other things. So I feel really sad about that. And there are many men and women who have suffered throughout the generations because of the condemnation of people who should have known better and people who should have known that love is always the answer. I hope you like this interview. Hi, I'm David Ailiff, and this affable life. Coronavirus has changed our lives dramatically, and the possibility of not having a vaccine is growing, even though there are so many vaccines that are being tested at the moment. A previous virus, which caused huge social impact on the world, was HIV Aids. And to date, millions of people have died of AIDS. And there are many, many more millions who are living with the disease. In 2018, the WHO says that's the World Health Authority, 32 million people had died of HIV since the beginning of the epidemic. Moreover, of the 37.9 million people living with HIV in 2018, just over 770,000 died in 2018. At this stage, we have over 700,000 deaths from COVID globally. Today, I'm interviewing a very interesting man, Jeff Alshorn, who has been documenting the AIDS virus and the social impact, particularly in the city in which he lives, Melbourne. So, hi, Jeff, how are you?
Hi, I'm good, thanks. Yes, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you. And I love the look of your, behind you there, you've got a bookcase full of books. And can I guess on what sort of subject they are?
Well, you can actually, given what we're talking about. Yes, it is. It's actually some of the books I've been using for my research. So,
wow, it's a massive task. Jeff, to start with, I'm going to put a video up of a documentary that was put up 8 years ago, and one of the speakers there, you will see, is Dr. Anthony Fauci, who we've seen a lot of lately, appearing with the Donald in America, and quite often some of Donald Trump's utterings, or gutterings, or guttural, whatever he says, which have not been consistent with Fauci on all kinds of things, like quinine as a treatment for COVID, and also the wonderful one about taking antiseptic. I think that was quite brilliant, really. But,
yes.
So this is quite interesting, and it's a good way of coming into what we're talking about. So I'll put it on, and then we can start talking.
April 12th, 1987, my 33rd birthday, 3 months before my wedding day. The doctor called and told me on the phone that I was, in fact, positive.
At that time, it was practically a death sentence.
The first time I encountered patients with HIV was during my residency training in Boston in 1985. Most of the patients had very advanced disease, and we didn't have any treatment. People didn't make it out of the hospital.
In the late spring of 1981, on my desk was the June 5th issue of Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report. 5 gay men from Los Angeles, very, very sick with a pneumonia that you only see in people who are immunosuppressed. 1 month later was the second report of 26 individuals, again, curiously, all gay men from LA, San Francisco, and New York, all presenting with this unusual syndrome of not only pneumocystis pneumonia, but several of them had Kaposi sarcoma. And I can remember thinking, my goodness, this is something really new and really scary.
Physicians, even in infectious diseases and in internal medicine, were quite afraid. The first patient that was admitted, the reaction of the staff to this individual was as if he were carrying smallpox.
It was not recognized at all at the time of the New England Journal of Medicine paper in late 1981 for the potential seriousness of what it really was.
It was very frustrating because we were seeing multiple infections in a single individual in a fashion that was just overwhelming and disfiguring. We had to deal with end-of-life issues on a regular basis.
To make matters worse, the disease carried a terrible social stigma because it was seen most commonly in gay men and IV drug users.
People would say, well, you deserve this for this terrible life that you're leading. There was a lot of bad stuff there with regard to stigma, intolerance, insensitivity to what these people were going through.
The CDC established in 1982 that the virus was transmitted sexually and by infected blood to drug users and hemophiliacs. But that didn't stop the speculation, misinformation, and fear.
People believed HIV was transmitted by mosquitoes or toilet seats or by kissing or eating on utensils or drinking from people's water glasses, all sorts of things.
In 1984, French and American researchers discovered the cause of AIDS. It was a retrovirus they called human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV, that attacked the immune system and integrated into the genome of our CD4 cells. Within a year, a blood test for AIDS was developed. It revealed that the virus could lay dormant for years, suggesting that we were seeing just the tip of the iceberg.
Even those of us who were in it from day one were shocked by the enormity of the problem.
Jeff, how does it make you feel? I mean, you've seen so much stuff there, but how does it make you feel looking back and seeing stuff like that video we've just seen?
Yeah, very mixed feelings, I think. I look at that and I see people who I still to this day consider to be heroes.
Yeah.
I looked at them then as the same, but I'm conflicted because, like, certainly with people I've spoken to about this history, a lot of people invoke like war, and it was a battle, it was a war, for a number of reasons, and I think absolutely it was. It was a time of chaos, great fear, great stigma and prejudice, and yet also great courage, great heroism. And that's partly why I think that that's really important that we document this history, because there are so many people who deserve to be remembered and so many stories that we can learn from, I hope.
Yeah, I'm sure there are, and I know that you've documented a lot of those. So I'm really grateful for you talking with us today. The video I shared before has a title on YouTube. It was first put up 8 years ago, and it's said "The Plague of Our Time," the HIV AIDS epidemic, and yet that plague has now been superseded by COVID.
Yeah. Yes, I think there are certainly similarities you could draw up with that, and at the same time there are differences as well. I think, you know, HIV in those days was not as contagious as COVID is today. You could only get it particularly through specific means: unsafe sex, sharing needles, various things like that, blood transfusions. But on the other hand, especially in the early days, unlike COVID, HIV, if allowed to progress to AIDS, was often seen as pretty much an automatic death sentence. It was almost like 100% death rate in the early days. And so that was part of the fear, because the difference is with the virus HIV, the human immunodeficiency virus, in itself, what it did was it attacked your it attacks your immune system, and if left unchecked, it would eventually progressively destroy your body's ability to fight diseases and so on. And people in the early days only found out they had it when their immune system had become so compromised that they became vulnerable to a whole range of diseases, including things that people normally didn't get. And by the time they were diagnosed, for many of them, it was pretty much already too late. So there was a great fear of, am I going to get it? Because if I'm suddenly diagnosed with it, my life expectancy is possibly in months or weeks or whatever. So yeah, great fear, and certainly until the HIV, the virus was discovered as the cause. And what I'm looking at in particular is that experience here in Melbourne. I think Melbourne was certainly largely connected to Sydney through the gay networks and so on. And again, with New York City, and with San Francisco, and with London, and various other cosmopolitan places that had large gay communities. And yet we had our own experiences. We did things slightly differently from other places and so on. We had people here who contributed to, like, when people did things here in Melbourne, it impacted what happened in Sydney, it impacted what happened across Australia, things like that. We learned from the mistakes of people overseas, and so on. So it was all like a big interconnected, almost like a social network, before social media, modern social media. There was no internet, no mobile phones. It was all word of mouth, or actually going to visit overseas and going for a holiday in Los Angeles or something, and making friends and hearing from them by letter sometimes.
Yes.
So
the huge difference, of course, between the official response to AIDS and the official response to COVID is that governments responded in different ways to AIDS, and in some cases, like in America, you had Ronald Reagan, who didn't even want to mention the word, even though lots of people in his acting sphere of friends would have been suffering. And there were
Yes.
some pretty obvious examples of that. But
Yes, well, that's right.
Today, we've got a different situation where governments have been forced to respond because of the size of the thing. Jeff,
Yes.
can I just give us a bit of a background about yourself?
Okay.
You're a young fella.
Oh well, I was in those days. Yes, I'm late 50s now. I grew up. I was in my very early 20s when AIDS arrived. I was born and bred in Melbourne.
Yeah.
Had what I suppose I considered at the time a fairly average suburban upbringing. My family were my father was a scientist in the chemical industry. My mother was sort of a housewife / secretary, which a lot of women were in those days.
Yeah.
But they went to church. They considered themselves good Christians, and I sort of certainly spent my young years going to church and Sunday school and youth group and all those things, and considered that fairly normal. That sort of came back to bite me kind of a bit later. But yes, I grew up. I became a school teacher. I think my earliest conscious recollection of AIDS was the first year I was teaching, and one of the teenage boys, because I was a secondary school teacher, one of the teenage boys made a coded joke about gay people, and I realised that he was making a reference to AIDS. Because in those days there was seen to be a lot of connection that if you were gay equals AIDS, and AIDS equals death.
Yes.
And there was that sort of connection that gay people, therefore, going to die or whatever. And I look back at that and I think, well, that's interesting that my first conscious recollection of that is teenagers making that sort of connection.
Yes.
Really rather strange in hindsight. I came back because I was out of Melbourne. I came back to Melbourne in the late 80s, got involved in the HIV / gay communities down here or through examples that I'll probably talk about. I was a school teacher for many years. I was active during those AIDS years as a carer, as I used some of my teaching skills to help organise training sessions for new volunteers who are coming in to become activists or to become carers, things like that. I was involved with the Aids Quilt and the Memorial Candlelight Vigils. I knew a lot of people who died. I lost a number of close friends who died. So I look back at that as, I think I might have said, as a little bit of a war zone, and a lot of people looking back say that to me. AIDS was very much a problem. It was a crisis, really, here in Australia as it was across everywhere. For most of the decades in the 1980s and 90s, starting kind of around 1981, going to late 90s, 96, 97. And my study as such is titled A Social History of HIV AIDS in Melbourne during what I call the crisis years, 1981 to 1997. And I think anyone who lived through that era and was involved would understand immediately why I picked those years and so on, and what I mean by crisis. But I've been interviewing some people who were carers, who were activists, some people who at that time were diagnosed with what was then called full-blown AIDS, managed to survive long enough to get onto the modern antiretrovirals and survive. I've also done a lot of research, like the books I've mentioned before. I've also looked at quite a few of the newspaper clippings, because I think newspapers are much more available. It's much easier to find online these days, but also in libraries on microfilm, old newspapers, and look up clippings.
Yes.
Whereas you can't really do that with old news footage from the TV news or something. That's not so accessible. But I think newspaper clippings are great because they give you a glimpse into what people were reading, what people were either thinking or were being led to think in those days. That this was the information that they had access to,
Yes.
whether it was right or whether it was wrong. And a lot of quotes of people saying things that now we look back and think that's remarkably bigoted or homophobic or whatever.
Yes.
You know, a lot of people sort of talking about AIDS as divine punishment. All sorts of things. And one thing that I really liked about that film clip you showed was it showed that AIDS was not just something that affected gay men. There were haemophiliacs, there were women, there were injecting drug users, there were people from particular backgrounds like Haiti in the early days in America.
Yep.
There was a whole range of people, and although it was first really discovered in the gay male population in America, because they were the people who were affluent enough to have access to good medical treatment, and doctors started thinking, why are these people getting sick? And then in hindsight, historians have started saying, well, no, there were African Americans, there were Haitians, there were all sorts of people.
Yeah.
There was pediatric AIDS. There was all sorts of people, not just in America, but across various countries. And certainly in Africa, people had been suffering from this for many years. It was called SLIM in some places in Africa because of the loss of body
Wasting
weight.
of the body fat. Yeah.
Yes, the wasting of the body fat. And all that was kind of missed until it hit the affluent gay male community in America, where people started saying, why are these people dying? What's going on?
Yeah.
So although a lot of people blamed gay men at the time for spreading this disease and whatever, in a way, gay people actually contributed to it by helping expose it to the world and making doctors and scientists aware that something terrible is going on.
Yeah. Back in those years that you've described, and of course, AIDS apparently goes back to the 1920s. The first in parts of it in Africa, but in that period that you talked about of your experience of all this, I was first of all involved in a fundamentalist Christian group for quite a number of years, where the common view was probably that it was a sense of judgment and all that sort of thing. Then I went on to head a fairly conservative Christian mission organization, which was, in many ways a great organization. But I remember the attitude that seemed to pervade throughout the community, the Christian community at the time, again, was still, judgment and so on. Fortunately, I didn't seem to share those views, but I couldn't really, be too adamant or too public about the views that I held at the time. There was a fellow called Tony Campolo, who is a Baptist minister in America and a sociologist, who had some fairly interesting public debates about the issues of homosexuality and AIDS and so on. His wife had a more liberal view than his, and yet his view was fairly liberal to a degree. One story he talked about was a gay funeral where the minister held the funeral and at the graveside, and when it was finished, the people gathered around who were obviously part of that gay community were sort of just hanging there, just standing there, and the minister said, is there anything else that I can do for any of you, And each of them then in turn asked for him to read some passage of scripture that they knew. And so after he did that, he said to them, you all seem to have a pretty strong recollection of the Bible. What churches do you go to? And I always remember the response, which I find very, very cruel. And the answer was, what churches will have us? Now that goes back probably to the 90s, I imagine. And in many areas, things have changed a great deal since then. They also haven't changed in some places. Jeff, can I ask you to for a couple of stories. Now, you were caring for friends at the time, and you said that you actually were able to use your teaching skills to help people understand the things that they needed to do and the processes and so on. Would you like to talk a little bit about that, and maybe a couple of stories about some of those forgotten heroes?
Oh, look, I think there's a lot of forgotten heroes. I've even found that with my PhD, when people find out I've been doing this study, they'll often come up and ask me questions about, well, exactly what is safe sex, or how can I avoid being exposed, or whatever.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of curiosity there, which is great. But I think looking back in terms of, well, certainly teaching, I knew school children. I knew one young woman who was doing a Year 12 project at a school, and she decided she would make a panel of the Aids Quilt. And for anyone who doesn't know, the Aids Quilt was a memorial. It's still here in Victoria, but it was designed to be basically the size of a grave plot, like about 1 metre by 2 metres,
Yes.
a panel of material. And on that panel, people were welcome to put anything they liked to memorialise someone that they'd lost. And she decided she was going to make one to fight stigma and discrimination. And she made a panel about children who'd been lost.
Yeah.
And what I found really fascinating was a lot of her school friends got involved in with it as well. And I think that was great. I'm trying to think of examples that because there are so many. I think one that comes to mind, which is not something that I was personally involved in, but something that comes to mind when you were talking about COVID before, the difference. I recall, for example, there was such stigma and discrimination that in the very early days, even before HIV had been discovered, there was one young gay man who quite innocently and quite with every noble intention had donated blood. And it turned out his blood had HIV in it, and it was given to a number of babies, and they died.
Oh.
And when this was exposed, the media had a field day. And I remember the front page of one newspaper saying, "Die, you deviant."
Oh, dear.
And that was sort of not uncommon in those days. And I thought of that recently because, of course, with COVID and in Australia, there's been media attention, and I won't go into details because that's the whole point, but where certain people have been targeted as having potentially spread this thing, and how could they be so horrible or whatever. And I think this is the same type of scapegoating, finding people to point the finger at. It's all your fault, and sort of a lynch mob mentality. And I think it's appalling that 30 years later or whatever, that we haven't learned from that. That probably doesn't answer your question really, but yeah.
How about someone that if it's not too painful, do you have a particular friend that you helped through this process?
Well, I recall one friend who did tell me that when he came to Melbourne, he was like a lot of gay people in the early days, in the 70s and 80s. A lot of gay people flocked to the big cities like Sydney and Melbourne, and overseas Los Angeles and so on, or San Francisco, to get away from small country town attitudes, religiosity, prejudice, whatever. And they'd come to, like in his case, he came to Melbourne. He was only young, in his 20s. He got involved with a group of other young gay men who'd all arrived, and they were all sort of looking for friends. And they became a very close-knit community of friends and a clique, and they did everything, tried sex, drugs, rock and roll together, whatever. And they found that we've finally found, like, we have our biological families back in wherever we came from, but this is my other real family here. And to them, they were just starting life, and they were young and fresh and full of enthusiasm. And then one by one, they started getting sick and dying. And he told me that, for example, his first friend who died, to that day when he told me, he said, we still don't know where he was buried because his family refused people to come to the funeral, refused. And I think he was a good example because, like, there were times when he needed assistance. There were times when I think he probably taught me things as well. And it was just so many convoluted interactions. Like I found with care teams in general, one of the things I found remarkable about them was it didn't matter what your background was. There were some people, for example, who said, well, I'm Catholic or I'm Christian and I want to care for people because this is part of my Christian motivation to help people and to express compassion. And other people who, like me, who sort of, well, I'm atheist and I don't care. And but what I found interesting was there was absolutely no discrimination, and no one at any point said, well, you can only do this work if you are Christian or you are atheist or whatever. Everyone was absolutely accepting of everyone else.
Yes.
And there were housewives. I remember one man telling me that some of the housewives who were involved on care teams were so concerned about the privacy issues with the men they were helping that they wouldn't tell anyone what they were doing, which is fair enough. But he actually said to them, well, I think you better tell your husbands why you're out late at night doing secret work or whatever, because he said this almost in an amused sense, looking back, that, oh, I better make sure that these women are, the husbands aren't suspecting worse. But I mean, these carers, I think they taught me so much. I remember going to an early meeting of the Aids Quilt and walking in, there were mums who'd lost sons, there were gay men who'd lost partners, there were family, like sisters who'd lost brothers, there were all sorts of people. There were people who were grieving, there were people who were living in fear because, am I next? Am I going to go next? People from, various backgrounds. And I walked in and we were talking, we were having cups of tea together, we were hugging, people were passing boxes of tissues around to cry and hug and whatever. And having come from a background of Christianity and having sort of worked through that and no longer believing, I stood there. I remember it. I stood there astonished. It was like an epiphany. I thought, there is more unconditional love in this room than in any church or religious group I'd ever been in. People didn't care if you were one of these horrible gay people or whether you had HIV or whether you were a mum or what. They were just totally accepting, totally unconditional. And I just found that remarkable, that especially when people were going out caring for people who were sick, they were going out, taking them out shopping, taking them out to doctor's appointments. And then when they got sick, they were there changing the bed sheets when they had night sweats. They were there cleaning up their mouth or vomiting. They were holding their hands as they were dying. Some of them were remarkable. I knew one woman who I was proud to call friend, and she was almost like a stereotypical little old lady. She could have been anyone's grandma. And I think she kind of adopted a lot of young gay men who were alone, didn't have family supporting them or whatever. She cared for them until they died and went to their funeral, and then she adopted another one. And she went from person to person. And a lot of them, I think, sort of adopted her as like, you're my other mum or something. And she's gone now, but I remember at one point she was talking to people and someone said, well, how many of these men have you cared for? And she said words to the effect that I think she'd lost count when she'd been to about the 100th funeral.
Wow.
And I thought, wow, how can you do that? How can you have the strength of character to, to just deal with that? So there were remarkable people. I mean, I think, like I said before, it wasn't just gay men. There were a lot of women, some lesbians, some straight women, some bisexual, some grandmothers, sisters. They were activists out in the streets holding up signs saying, "I love my gay son."
Yeah.
They were carers. They were people who made panels for the Aids Quilt. And in fact, one thing I was going to mention was, as an example, virtually the very first biography, there have been very few AIDS biographies or autobiographies published in Australia, but the first published biography, well, the first autobiography was by a gay man,
Yeah,
who come from America. But the first biography was by a woman who lives in Melbourne now.
wow.
Maria Pallotta Chiaroli, a fantastic woman. I'm proud to say I know her. She wrote a book, and this was published in 1991, and it was the first book I actually remember seeing in a bookshop. It was actually about AIDS, and it was
Wow.
about her friend, a gay man who died.
Yep.
And she, like a number of other women, I think, used their position of, we're not gay men, so we don't have that stigma, we don't have that prejudice attached to us, but we love and care for gay men, or for family, for friends, for sons, for daughters, whoever.
Yeah.
And they used their position to promote compassion and support for people who are stigmatized. And I think that's fantastic.
Oh, that is wonderful. Absolutely. Jeff, it must have been both a rewarding experience to be writing your thesis, your PhD, which hopefully now will turn into a book. But it must have also been painful revisiting this stuff.
Oh, I think so. I think that's part of the reason it's taken me longer than I probably expected, because, I mean, yes, it is rewarding. I've had the opportunity to sit down with some people who, like I think I said before, I still consider some of these people, they were role models and mentors for me back in the 80s or 90s.
Yeah.
But even today, I still look at them and think, these people are bloody heroes.
Yeah.
And to be able to sit down with them and have conversations, and one that floored me, one prominent activist who I interviewed, and as soon as I started the interview, and as soon as he knew, "Are you recording this?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "All right, the first thing I want to say, Jeff, is thank you for what you did," because he remembered, like he must have worked with thousands of people. And yet he remembered that I'd been involved in what I'd been involved with. And I thought, wow, what a remarkable person that, you know, he cares so much that he can remember someone who to him would have been relatively obscure at the time. And yeah, but I think it's remarkable because, like, I've wanted, in fact, I'll show you. I don't know if you can see. Oh, it's in plastic, so it might not show. Does that show terribly well? That's a newspaper clipping. I've just put it in a little
Test
frame.
of Friendship. Yes.
Yeah, a tragic test of friendship. This was published in the Sun newspaper, as it was in Melbourne, and I can even tell you the date, because it would an easy date to remember, the 8th of the 8th, 88.
Oh, wow.
Which actually makes 32 years ago yesterday as we speak. But that story, I remember reading that. It was just another story in the paper. But it was a story about a young man in Sydney who'd been diagnosed and he was dying with AIDS. And he decided, or his friends decided, that they were going to give him a sort of farewell party or whatever to support him, because he told them he had cancer. So the arrangements were made, and when he arrived for the party, arrived in an ambulance, being carried into the house on a stretcher by ambulance attendants who were, you know, like a spacesuit from head to toe.
Yep.
His friends realised, hey, he's got AIDS. They all fled out the back door and left him alone. And the doctor reported that this young man died of a broken heart 48 hours later. And I remember that. I mean,
That's
I'm probably
awful.
emotional thinking about it now.
Yeah.
But, yeah, I mean, I was, you know, roughly, I mean, it didn't say how old he was, but I mean, I was a young man at that point too. And I thought, that's awful. And that was the point where I think I remember thinking, someone should remember these stories, and someone, you know, people should be documenting this history. Because the good things and the bad, we need to remember these things, and we need to learn from them.
Look, we certainly do, and I really commend you for the task that you've taken on so important,
Thanks.
really. I think I told you the story of a clergyman who, and I will keep this anonymous, but a clergyman who told the story of a funeral of a gay man that he'd been caring for with the gay man's partner. And when he came to do the funeral, the parents arrived sitting in the front seat, and the clergyman asked the question, why were they there? Which was very unusual. And they replied, well, he was our son. And he then said to them, well, you had no interest in his life with his partner. So why would you have an interest in his death? Because they put this boy out of his home at the age of, I think, 17 or something like that, when he'd come out as being gay. And there were so many stories like that, and you've already alluded to one before where parents would come in and take over all the details in the hospital or arrangements for the funeral, and the person that had been there caring for the dying man or the deceased was put out of it altogether because you don't matter. Sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say there were lots of stories like that people have told me, going to funerals where they knew the person, it was a friend of theirs. He'd been gay, he died of AIDS, and yet at the funeral, suddenly the story was, oh, he had cancer, or he died in a car accident, or whatever. One person told me he attended a funeral where the family showed slides of this is our son all through his life as a baby and then as a young boy and blah, blah, blah. And the family photos stopped when he was about 21, because that's when he'd been left home or kicked out or whatever. And he died in his 30s or 40s after having had gay friends and gay relationships for many years. But, according to the funeral, his life effectively ended when he was about 21. Things like that. And, gay partners who were sort of disinherited and told you can't come to the hospital, you're not next of kin, kicked out of the house that they might have shared with a partner for years. All these sorts of terrible stories. And in fact, that was one thing that struck me when I was thinking about what I might say today, that I think a lot of that had a good side. I mean, it was a terrible time to go through, but it just struck me a lot of people in those days were outraged. A lot of the activists were outraged. And you can see, like, for example, my button saying Save Fairfield Hospital, because things were happening that was an activist badge. But there were other concerns about, for example, here are people who have been disinherited from their partner, from their inheritance, their shared house, their superannuation, their people who were excluded from funerals, all sorts of things. And it's about time we started having family rights and inheritance rights and next of kin rights and recognition as spouses, etc., etc. And I think, looking back, that started a campaign that took probably about 30 years. But I think a lot of young LGBT people today who are too young to remember this era and who might say, well, it didn't really affect me. I think what they need to realise probably is that the fact that marriage equality was passed about 2 years ago was, I would argue, a direct result coming out of this terrible situation of deprivation of rights and equality decades ago. And it started a whole campaign that took many years because there was a lot of resistance. But it just sort of struck me that, what people went through their world back then has impacted upon our world today for LGBT people here in Australia.
So many things that we do need to remember from the past. And I agree with you that we need to remember these things. Now, you've just removed your white hat. Tell us about your white hat.
Yeah, my white hat, which I'm wearing today, I have to admit I don't normally wear it much, especially indoors. I chose to wear this today because this is one of the very few bits of clothing I have left from that era which I can specifically identify as being from that era because one of the activities I was involved with was the Aids Quilt that I've mentioned before.
Yes.
And part of that was there were like the tapestries on the quilts that had names and photos and all sorts of things and lots of colour. And as one of the people who supervised the quilt displays and helped to open the panels and do all sorts of things, one of the things we were asked to do was to wear all white. Because white was seen, two reasons. One was because it was a sort of homage to the medical staff who cared for so many of these people who died.
Yes.
And the other was because white was seen, if we wore all white, it would not detract or distract from the colours and the messages on the quilts that were all the colours. So, you know, we wore white literally from head to toe. I had a white scarf, white gloves, white clothes, white shoes, all of it.
Yep.
And yeah, so, and in fact, when you were at a quilt display or a candlelight march, that was one way of recognising people who were sort of in charge or whatever. You could recognise someone was decked out in white from head to toe. I mean, we cheated a bit. We might have a few badges on, but apart from that, it was, yeah. But yes, that's why I wore that today in recognition of that era. I think the quilt for me, and maybe this is an answer to a part of an answer to your question before about teaching and so on. I found the quilt was really an astonishingly good educational tool for people.
Yes.
Because they'd all heard statistics of all these, you know, thousands of nameless, faceless gay people, these disgusting people who died, and serves them right, it's God's punishment or whatever. And yet we'd have quilt displays in the exhibition buildings and we'd have the doors open and the colours could be seen from outside and people would come in attracted by what's going on in here, what's in the colours. And I remember, for example, young families came in, a young couple with little toddler age kids, and they're pushing a pusher. And the kids want to come in because they can see colours and what's going on, and they're running around. They don't really understand what it is, but they can see there's names, there's photos, there's clothing, there's teddy bears, there's all sorts of things attached to these quilts. And they're running around saying, "Mummy, Daddy, look at this. What's this all about?" And you look back at the parents, they've walked in and they've realised what it's all about, and they've burst into tears. They're standing there sobbing. You know, and you know, I can remember stories of people who, you know, have come up to me and said, you know, this quilt has changed my life because for the first time I see people with AIDS as really human, but also gay people as really human. You know, and it's astonishing. Some of those sorts of stories are, you know, I know kids, like I mentioned before, school kids, teenagers who'd come along and they'd sort of want to make posters or whatever. And, you know, at one place where we had a bit of a display, there were kids who'd sort of tried to work out how to make posters to encourage people to have safe sex or whatever. How could you do that as a school kid? One kid had saxophones, and the caption was "Have safe sax," which I thought for that age was really quite good.
That's
brilliant.
great.
If you're there,
it's clever.
whoever you are, kid, if you're still there listening to this, good on you.
Go for it.
You know, and yeah, I think I found a lot of young people, and it goes to anti-homophobia education too. I think a lot of young teenage kids really appreciated when people were able to maybe treat them like a bit of an adult and say, well, here's information that's like it's grown-up information, presented in age-appropriate ways. They really appreciated being treated a little bit as an adult, whereas I think a lot of adults are saying, oh my God, you can't talk to kids about that, you know. So, and I found that a lot of the kids were much more open-minded. Even homophobia, related indirectly to this topic, I guess, is one thing that I remember as a school teacher that I think had a great impact on challenging homophobia was an episode of Seinfeld from the early 90s, this era. That was an episode where Seinfeld and his friend George were mistakenly thought to be a gay couple, and they spent the whole episode running around with this running joke about, I'm not gay, not that there's anything wrong with that. And I remember that at school because for weeks, every time you're in a class and someone did something wrong, the kid would say, "Oh, not that there's anything wrong with that," because they'd picked that joke up. And I thought, well, this is normalizing
it's a
whole, a positive.
Yeah.
But,
That's great, Jeff.
Yeah.
I'm going to draw it to a close. There's so much more we could say. I mean, I'm a marriage celebrant, and I have to say that some of the greatest weddings that I've performed in the last couple of years have been same-sex weddings.
Same-sex, yeah.
And some of those I can imagine would have been in a church if a church would have had them. But they were very special, and some of them were quite, in a sense, religious experiences without the religion, if you like. So that's been something very special for me. Now, I want to ask you one question, and that is, what lessons do you think we can take from the AIDS crisis? And remembering that video that I started this off with said, the plague of our time, the HIV AIDS epidemic. Well, now we're in the middle of another plague, and in many ways much greater and much less discriminatory because it more widely affects the whole world. What lessons do you think we have learned or can apply?
Or we can, or we haven't learned, or whatever.
Or haven't applied,
Well, I think the obvious one that I think you referred to before was back in the very early days of AIDS in America, we had the Reagan administration that really did not step up and do what it needed to do at the start, and that forced a lot of community activists to become engaged to save their own lives. Early slogans were, "We're fighting for our lives," and things like that. And I look at, for example, in America today, the current administration, who similarly are not stepping up and doing what they really need to do. And
thousands are dying.
And thousands are dying. And that's absolutely, there's a similarity there. I mean, there's obvious dissimilarities too, but it just struck me, back in those days, there was so much community activism and people needing to step up. Like in Australia, the gay community, when AIDS first hit, there was this absolute absence of information in the mainstream media, and they just heard that, oh, there are these gay men dying, but we don't know what's going on, and so on. And a lot of the gay press had to step up, do the research, present the information. I know one early journalist in the gay media was later congratulated by someone in hindsight who said this particular one person probably did more to save lives than all the rest of the media in Australia put together. And I think one of the things we need to learn is this community empowerment and engagement. Like in the very early days of AIDS, in America, there was talk about, do we need to close down gay saunas or gay places where people might meet and have sex or whatever? And in America, it was sort of, oh, well, we need to close these places down because that will stop people from putting themselves at risk. Out here, there was more of a conversation about, wouldn't it be better to keep these places open and give people information on safe sex or how to protect themselves and things like that? And that's what we did here. We had one poster that was very famous in Victoria. It was two young men kissing. It was called the Kissing Boys poster, popularly. It was two young men kissing. And there was some fairly explicit text about, here's how to avoid getting HIV or AIDS. And it was aimed at a sort of a youth market, because they felt, well, these are people who are very much at risk and we need to. And yet, at least one magazine that sort of was fairly well known as having virtually every issue, lots and lots of photographs, particularly from soap operas or whatever, of young heterosexual couples kissing and whatever. This magazine decided we can't possibly print that Kissing Boys poster because, what will the parents think or whatever. And yet I know so many gay men who remember that poster because it was an attractive poster. It had vital information. And it gave them the information they needed to know.
Yeah.
And it sort of struck me, well, that's what, for example, with COVID, rather than saying to people, you know, stay home or else we'll give you a fine, maybe we need to think, for example, do a comparison with the early days. Look at the target group that is the highest risk of getting infected. And in Victoria or Australia, as I understand it, it's young people in their 20s, which is not uncommon, not dissimilar to what, a high risk group of AIDS in the early days. And rather than saying to them, you know, stay home or you'll get a fine or whatever it is, maybe we should be doing what we did with gay men or gay communities and saying, all right, what is the language, the vocabulary, the mindset that we need to address this in ways that they will find positive, will affirm them and empower them. And maybe I was thinking this before. I mean, for example, you know, not even wear a mask to protect grandma. I've seen that on Facebook, and that I don't think that works. But even things like protect your mates.
Yeah.
Protect your mates who are diabetic. Protect your mates who love their grandma.
Yeah.
Maybe something like that. I know in the early AIDS community, there was a lot of talk that sort of reflected the idea of we're all in this together. There was this idea that there were two groups impacted by AIDS. There were people who were infected, who had HIV, and then there were people who were affected. So there might be a gay man who was infected, and yet his whole family, his friends, his workmates, they were all affected.
Yes.
And the point was that we're all in this together. And I think there could be a lot more of that sort of dialogue in the community at the moment, rather than media scapegoating people or pointing the finger at, you know, politicians, are you doing enough? Maybe we should do that. What you were saying before about, religious groups and like churches, I know back in those days, Fairfield Hospital, there was actually a public campaign to raise money to build a chapel at Fairfield Hospital, because a lot of people didn't feel that their home family churches or whatever would allow their funerals or whatever. So there was that. And I remember contrasting that with a couple of people I know who I think I've told you about before. One was a middle-aged woman who'd lost her adult gay son.
Yeah.
And she was a very respectable suburban middle-class sort of woman, had lots of network connections with churches and schools and social clubs and bingo clubs or whatever. And there was one of the people that she knew and worked with was an HIV positive gay man who was a stereotypical, he's one of these other people who's got it.
Yes.
They used to go out together and they'd visit her churches and her bingo clubs or whatever. And they'd say, we want to give a talk about AIDS and HIV. She added the respectability of the middle-class respectability.
Yes.
And he was sort of, he's one of those people, you know.
Yeah.
But what they did was they went and gave a talk, and they'd make a point. They'd sit up the front of the church or the venue, and they'd always ask for a glass of water each at the start. And as they talked, they'd make a point of sipping their water, and she would pointedly make a point of drinking her glass very fast, relatively to him, and finishing her water first. And then as they were talking, she'd reach out and pick up her glass and sort of silently see it was empty. Without a word, she'd reach across and pick up his glass and have a sip from that. And they said to me afterwards, they could always hear gasps. You know, oh my God, she's drinking from a glass that a gay man with HIV is drinking from. You know, and it relates to what was in that video before about people being scared. Can you get it from toilet seats or cups or whatever? But they said to me afterwards, we actually think that silent gesture did more to destigmatize HIV and AIDS than probably everything we said.
Yes. Yes.
And I remember them because they came from divergent backgrounds. He was a gay man with AIDS at the time, an atheist. She was a respectable middle-class woman who presumably was Christian or certainly had all those networks with the churches. And yet they were friends, they worked together, they had common interest in respect and education and, you know, love thy neighbour and all that. and they work together. And to me, that's something that I think we can all learn from this, that there were so many people who did work together, regardless of their religious or political backgrounds or whatever. And I think that's what we can learn today, hopefully.
I agree.
In a lot of places, yeah.
Yeah,
So,
I agree. Well, look, Jeff, thank you so much for your time today. And I really wish you well in putting the rest of the book together. I hope that more than one or two people watch our little podcast here. I'm sure they will. And if people do want to contact you if they've got other stories to add and so on, is there a contact point we can provide, or can they can put comments? They can put comments on the YouTube channel.
Yes,
and I can perhaps refer them on to you from there if that helps.
Yes, that'd be fantastic. Yes, thank you.
All right, that's great. All right, well, thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you, David.